He was just her student, until one teasing comment changed everything. The classroom felt unusually warm that late afternoon, the sun filtering through the blinds in soft golden slats that painted lines across the desks. He noticed it immediately, not just the sunlight, but the way she moved through the room, a subtle grace in every step. She was reviewing the day's material with that calm, confident ease that made it seem effortless, but he could tell she cared deeply about her students. He had always admired her from a distance, not just for her knowledge, though that alone was impressive, but for the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her. Her laughter was soft, yet it carried a warmth that made the corners of the room feel lighter. She didn't speak to everyone the same way. He had noticed the gentle way her eyes lingered on those who tried, those who wanted to learn. And today, when she paused to smile at him across the room, it felt like recognition, a private acknowledgement that made his heart skip. Extra credit, she mentioned casually at the end of class, flipping through her notes, is available for anyone who wants to go the extra mile. Her voice was teasing, light, but something in her gaze made it feel pointed in his direction. He shifted in his seat, trying not to seem obvious as he processed the words. Was it just part of her teaching style, or was there something more personal in the invitation? The question lingered in his mind long after the classroom emptied. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway as other students filed out, but he stayed seated, unsure why he couldn't move just yet. He noticed the faint scent of her perfume, floral but understated, lingering even as she packed her things. There was a small moment where she looked up, caught him lingering, and gave a smile that was just slightly longer than professional courtesy. That smile carried warmth, amusement, and a spark of something unspoken. He tried to focus on his notes, pretending to review the day's material, but his thoughts kept wandering to the way her hair caught the light when she tucked it behind her ear, the subtle gestures she made that somehow conveyed both authority and approachability. There was a delicate balance about her, a mixture of confidence and quiet vulnerability, and he found himself captivated by it. When she finally glanced at him again, holding his gaze for just a moment longer than necessary, she said with that playful tone that had always intrigued him, "If you're serious about extra credit, I'll see you after class." It was simple, almost casual, but the words carried weight. In that instant, the ordinary classroom became something charged with anticipation, a space where ordinary routines could suddenly feel extraordinary. As he gathered his things, his heart was racing, partly from nerves, partly from excitement, and partly from a sense of curiosity he couldn't fully explain. That single invitation, casual though it seemed, had changed the atmosphere completely. The day had begun like any other, but now it carried the possibility of something unexpected, a moment that could alter the rhythm of their interactions, slowly, subtly, and in ways he was only beginning to imagine. This first encounter set the stage, the spark of tension, the undercurrent of mutual awareness, and the unspoken question of what might happen if they both allowed themselves to cross the invisible line between teacher and student. The story was only just beginning. The classroom had emptied, leaving only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint scratch of her pen on paper. He hesitated by the door, unsure whether to leave or accept the unspoken invitation lingering in the air. She looked up from her notes, meeting his gaze with a smile that felt warm, inviting, and slightly mischievous. "Glad you decided to stay," she said, her tone casual, but the subtle inflection made his chest tighten. He moved toward his desk, every step weighted with anticipation, aware of how quiet the room had become. The sunlight had shifted, slanting through the blinds and catching the dust in tiny golden motes, creating a calm, almost magical atmosphere. The ordinary classroom suddenly felt intimate, as though the walls themselves were watching their interaction. She gestured to a diagram on the board, explaining a concept he had struggled with in class. He leaned in, trying to focus on the details, but found his attention constantly drifting toward her, the gentle curve of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed softly at his small mistakes. Her presence seemed to fill the space, commanding attention without demanding it. When she moved closer to adjust the diagram, her hand brushed his shoulder lightly. The touch was fleeting, professional enough to seem accidental, yet he felt an electric jolt run through him. His heart raced, but he tried to appear calm, focusing on the task while aware of the proximity that suddenly made the air feel warmer, heavier. The faint scent of her perfume mixed with the paper and chalk, creating a sensory memory he knew he would carry with him. As they worked side by side, there were moments where their hands came close while pointing at the same section of the notes, their fingers almost brushing. Each near touch carried a tension that neither spoke aloud but both felt deeply. He noticed how her posture relaxed around him, how her laugh softened in his presence, and how she seemed to study him in a way that was both attentive and personal. It was a delicate dance, a slow unfolding of closeness that neither rushed nor forced itself. At one point, she paused, leaning slightly on the edge of his desk to point something out, their faces close enough that he could see the subtle warmth in her expression. He caught a fleeting glance in her eyes, a mixture of amusement, curiosity, and something more profound that made his pulse quicken. It was the kind of moment that lingered in his mind, making ordinary gestures feel charged with meaning. When the session ended, she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile and said, "You're learning fast. I might have to come up with more extra credit." Her words were light, playful, but the underlying tone suggested a shared secret, an acknowledgement of the connection they were beginning to form. As he packed his things, he realized the room no longer felt like a classroom. It had become a space where boundaries were gently tested, where subtle touches and lingering glances spoke louder than words. The encounter left him exhilarated, conflicted, and utterly aware of the magnetic pull between them. This was the moment the slow burn truly began, the point where awareness shifted into something more intimate, and both of them understood, without saying it aloud, that their connection was no longer purely academic. The days following their first close encounter carried a subtle shift in the classroom. He found himself more aware of her presence, each glance or smile from her sparking an undercurrent of excitement he could barely contain. She seemed to notice the change too, the way his posture straightened when she addressed him, the way his pencil hovered over notes a little longer, waiting for her approval. It started small. During a review session, she corrected one of his answers with a gentle, teasing tone. "I see someone has been paying extra attention," she said, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. He felt a warmth spread across his chest, partly pride, partly the thrill of her attention. The subtle playfulness in her voice made him sit a little straighter, trying not to blush. Their interactions became a delicate game, teasing remarks mixed with encouragement. She'd point out minor mistakes with a soft chuckle, leaning just slightly closer than necessary to illustrate a point. Each time, he noticed the faint brush of her hand against his arm or the soft tilt of her head, as if inviting him into a private conversation without uttering a word. The tension between them was quiet, almost invisible to anyone else in the room, but palpable to them both. One afternoon, she paused to review his assignment, her eyes scanning the page. "You've really improved," she said, her tone light, almost conspiratorial. Then, without missing a beat, she added, though I might need to see a little more effort if you want all your extra credit." The corner of her mouth lifted in that way that made him wonder if the challenge was academic or personal. He stammered a response, caught off guard, and she laughed softly, a sound that lingered in the air long after the words had faded. It wasn't just words that conveyed the playfulness, it was the small gestures that accompanied them. She'd tap a pencil against his notebook while explaining, her hand lingering a moment too long. She'd brush a smudge off his sleeve, her fingers grazing his arm in a casual but deliberate way. Each movement carried a rhythm, a subtle invitation, and he became increasingly conscious of the space between them. Their playful banter wasn't just flirtation, it became a bridge for emotional intimacy. Through jokes and teasing, he began to understand her, her subtle humor, her careful attention to detail, her quiet encouragement. She, in turn, seemed to study him with the same care, noticing his hesitations, his eagerness, his quiet admiration. Their connection was deepening, layer by layer, built on trust, laughter, and the thrill of shared moments that no one else witnessed. By the end of the session, he left the classroom with a lightness in his chest, replaying their exchanges in his mind. Each joke, each brush of her hand, each knowing glance left him acutely aware of the emotional closeness developing between them. It was the kind of connection that didn't need words to be understood, a silent acknowledgement of the slow, irresistible pull growing between student and teacher. The playful banter was no longer casual, it had become a language of its own, a way for them to explore closeness safely, teasing the boundaries of propriety while deepening trust and emotional intimacy. It was exhilarating, subtle, and entirely consuming. After weeks of playful banter and subtle closeness, he found himself caught in an unexpected storm of emotions. Sitting at his desk in the quiet library, notebook open but largely ignored, his thoughts were consumed by her, her smile, the light in her eyes, the warmth that seemed to follow her movements like a halo. He had admired her from afar before, but now, being near her, feeling the electric pull of small touches and shared laughter, everything seemed different, more intense, more impossible. He wrestled with hesitation. There was the obvious, she was his teacher, older, experienced, confident, and undeniably attractive. Society's voice echoed in his mind, a whisper of judgment and propriety. But there was another, subtler conflict, the fear of misreading her signals, of letting hope grow in a space where it might not belong. He had to remind himself constantly that every brush of her hand, every lingering glance, could be merely professional warmth, or it could be something more. The uncertainty made his heart pound in ways he had never expected. She noticed it too, he realized, though she never spoke directly of it. One afternoon, they lingered after class to review his essay. The library was quiet, the faint rustle of pages and distant footsteps forming a gentle background to their conversation. She leaned slightly closer to point out a correction, and for a moment, their knees brushed beneath the table. The contact was brief, accidental, or so it seemed, but it sent a shiver through him that he struggled to disguise. Her voice was soft as she discussed the essay, and in her eyes, he saw not just focus but a quiet curiosity. She shared small personal anecdotes, her tone light but edged with vulnerability, as if inviting him into a space she rarely allowed others to enter. He listened, captivated not only by the stories but by the glimpses of her beyond the confident teacher persona, glimpses of the woman who had lived, loved, and carried both joy and sorrow in her eyes. His hands fidgeted with his pen, a nervous habit he had tried to conceal for weeks. Each time she looked at him, he felt the weight of unspoken possibilities pressing down, a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. The room seemed smaller, warmer, as if their closeness was magnified by the silence. Even the faint smell of her perfume felt more intense, more intimate, seeping into his senses and making his thoughts harder to control. For the first time, he allowed himself to confront the depth of his feelings. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude for her teaching, it was something more profound, a longing to be seen and understood by her in a way that transcended classroom boundaries. Yet, the social and emotional risks loomed large, each one a reminder of why restraint was necessary. When the session ended, he packed his belongings slowly, reluctant to leave the space where connection had quietly deepened. She gave him a warm, knowing smile, one that seemed to acknowledge the storm of emotions swirling between them without a single word. That smile lingered in his mind long after he walked into the fading afternoon sunlight. This internal struggle, the tension between desire, propriety, and fear, became the emotional heartbeat of their relationship. It was no longer about playful teasing or casual encouragement. It was about navigating the fragile line between closeness and restraint, and it was this delicate balance that would define the slow burn of their story. The evening sun had dipped low, casting a soft, golden glow through the large classroom windows. He found himself sitting across from her at a small table, surrounded by open books and scattered papers. Tonight was supposed to be about a simple project review, extra credit, as she had teased, yet the air between them carried a different charge, one neither had explicitly acknowledged but both could feel. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, her fingers brushing against the edge of his notebook as she pointed out corrections. The movement was natural, professional, yet it brought an unexpected awareness of her presence. He noticed the subtle warmth radiating from her, the quiet grace in how she adjusted her hair as she spoke, and the soft cadence of her voice that seemed to pull him in closer with every word. As they discussed the assignment, their heads occasionally bent toward the same page, and for a fleeting moment, their shoulders touched. It was a light, almost incidental brush, yet it sent a ripple of awareness through him. He could feel her energy, calm, steady, and profoundly reassuring, mingling with his own nervous excitement. He became acutely conscious of the space between them, the way the air seemed to tighten subtly whenever their proximity increased. She smiled at a comment he made, a playful sparkle in her eyes, and reached to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The gesture, ordinary in appearance, carried a gentle intimacy. He felt a flutter of warmth in his chest, a blend of admiration and something deeper he struggled to define. Their laughter mingled softly, a quiet harmony that made the classroom feel like an isolated world where only the two of them existed. At one point, she rested a hand briefly on his arm as she corrected a miswritten note. The touch lingered just long enough to feel deliberate, yet brief enough to remain appropriate. He noticed the pulse of life in her hand, the warmth that seemed to seep into him, making his own heartbeat louder and his senses sharper. Words faltered in his mind, the conversation continued, but the unspoken tension hummed beneath every explanation and suggestion. He dared a glance up at her face, catching her expression in a moment of vulnerability, a soft, unguarded smile that seemed to bridge the gap between teacher and human being. She was confident and composed, yet in that instant, he saw her as someone who could be moved, influenced, and understood. And he realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, how deeply he wanted to be the person who could witness that side of her more fully. When the project session came to a close, they both lingered a moment longer, unwilling to break the spell. Their parting was quiet, a simple exchange of smiles and a soft handshake, yet the lingering warmth between them was unmistakable. That night, he walked home with a heightened awareness of everything: the faint scent of her perfume on his sleeve, the subtle weight of the brief touch on his arm, and the echo of a smile that would replay in his mind for hours. This first truly close moment was a turning point. It was not a declaration of romance, but a delicate exploration of emotional intimacy, a silent acknowledgement that something significant had begun, a connection defined by warmth, awareness, and restraint. It was the first step in a slow dance that neither of them fully understood yet, but both were irresistibly drawn to. The late afternoon sun had softened into a warm, amber glow, filling the small library corner where they had gathered to celebrate the completion of his extra credit project. The world outside felt distant, a quiet hum of life he could barely notice. All that mattered was the space between them, a space that had grown charged with unspoken emotions, a tension neither dared to name aloud but both felt keenly. He was acutely aware of her presence, the subtle warmth she carried, the quiet strength that radiated from her posture. She sat across from him, her elbows resting lightly on the table, fingers brushing against the pages of his work as she offered final thoughts. Their shoulders were close, the proximity unremarkable to an observer but electrifying to him. Every glance, every slight movement, seemed amplified in the intimacy of the setting. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second longer than usual, and he caught a softness there that had never been so evident before, a hint of vulnerability, a quiet trust she reserved only for him. He realized that, despite the careful boundaries she maintained, there was a part of her willing to let him see who she truly was. The thought made his chest tighten, a mixture of reverence, longing, and fear swirling within him. Neither spoke of it directly, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with unspoken acknowledgement, a mutual recognition of the feelings that had grown quietly over the past weeks. His fingers brushed hers briefly as he passed a notebook to her, an accidental touch that lingered just enough to make his pulse quicken. She didn't pull away, and the subtle warmth of her hand against his sent a jolt through him that left him momentarily breathless. He wanted to speak, to confess the emotions simmering inside him, the admiration, the fascination, the slowly growing affection, but words felt fragile, inadequate, too vulnerable for the moment. Instead, he allowed the silence to speak for him, letting the lingering glances, the small smiles, the near touches convey what he could not say aloud. She, in turn, met him halfway, her gestures deliberate yet subtle, her presence a quiet confession in itself. At one point, she leaned slightly closer to point out a note in his essay. Their faces were near enough that he could see the faint warmth in her expression, the slight curl of her lips, the sparkle of understanding in her eyes. He felt a rush of courage and fear, knowing that if either of them spoke, the delicate balance might shift irreversibly. Yet, in the unspoken space, the intensity of their connection was undeniable. As the session drew to a close, they lingered, neither wanting to break the spell. A soft laugh shared over a trivial mistake, a subtle brush of her hand against his arm, the way their eyes held each other's gaze a moment too long, all of it spoke louder than words. The silence between them was a shared language, a confession without confession, a recognition that their bond had grown into something meaningful, fragile, and profoundly intimate. Walking home that evening, he replayed every detail, the warmth of her hand, the weight of her gaze, the quiet acknowledgement of feelings neither had yet named. Silent confessions had been made, unspoken but understood, and the slow burn of their emotional intimacy reached a new, undeniable intensity. The classroom was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight filtering through the blinds. Today felt different. The usual hum of routine had been replaced by a tangible sense of closure, a gentle tension that had been building for weeks now. He stood near the door, watching her organize her notes, her movements calm yet deliberately unhurried. Every gesture, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the soft bend of her wrist as she adjusted a stack of papers, felt intimate in a way that made his pulse quicken. She looked up, catching his gaze, and a warm smile spread across her face. It was a smile that carried acknowledgement, understanding, and something more profound, a quiet admission that what had developed between them was no longer just subtle attraction or fleeting curiosity. He felt the familiar flutter of nerves, the familiar pull of longing, yet this time it was tempered by clarity. "I've enjoyed seeing how much you've grown," she said softly, her voice calm, yet edged with an unmistakable warmth. "Not just in your work, but in the way you notice things, the way you care." Her eyes lingered on him, and he felt an unspoken weight in her words, the acknowledgement of the emotional journey they had shared, of the connection that had blossomed carefully, deliberately, between them. He stepped closer, feeling the gentle warmth of the room envelope him. His hands hovered momentarily at his sides, unsure whether to break the distance or respect the quiet space they had cultivated. Then, with a courage he hadn't fully realized he possessed, he met her halfway, his gaze steady, his voice low and sincere. I think I understand now what this is between us. And I don't want to lose it." A soft laugh, almost a sigh, escaped her, and she closed the gap just enough to bridge the emotional space without crossing any line too quickly. Their shoulders brushed lightly, the contact subtle but charged with the depth of unspoken understanding. The air between them felt warmer, alive with possibility, yet grounded in respect and mutual care. They talked then, honestly, openly, about boundaries, emotions, and what they both wanted moving forward. There was hesitation, naturally, and acknowledgement of the age difference and societal expectations. But the honesty, the willingness to speak and listen, created a bridge over the uncertainty that had shadowed their connection. Their conversation was quiet, intimate, and full of the same warmth that had defined their interactions from the start. By the time they parted, there was a sense of resolution that neither had anticipated but both had needed. A gentle touch on his shoulder as he gathered his things, a lingering smile that promised understanding and care, a soft goodbye that conveyed more than words ever could. These were the moments that sealed the emotional arc. He walked out of the classroom with a calm clarity, heart still racing but grounded in the satisfaction of shared honesty. Their bond had been acknowledged, cherished, and respected. The slow burn had reached its natural conclusion, a connection that was deep, meaningful, and emotionally secure. Though the story could have gone in many directions, they left that afternoon with trust, warmth, and a bond that neither circumstance nor hesitation could diminish. It was a resolution of the heart, one that lingered long after the classroom lights dimmed, a quiet testament to the slow, deliberate journey of understanding, affection, and shared emotion.